Trevor McConchie. Trevor's the Federal Lands Assistant Division Manager for the Washington Department of Natural Resources. He oversees and manages the department's Federal Lands Program, and that program supports federal partners to increase the pace and scale of work on federal lands in Washington state. And Trevor will be talking to us about the Good Neighbor Authority Agreement.
All right, thank you, everybody. Pleasure to be here. Excellent discussion. I think it's pretty cool to have both Vicki and George talk about some of these sort of high-level concepts, and then what I'm going to try to do is bring it down to the ground, to the dirt, and actually talk with you guys about what we're accomplishing with Good Neighbor and how it kind of embodies some of the stuff with through shared stewardship. So today I'm going to take you through the Federal Lands Program, kind of what it is today and what we've accomplished, and then shift that into speaking about shared stewardship in relation to it with the lens of Good Neighbor, and then taking that through to an actual project that shows that it's not all roses, and it's hard to do this. It's hard to do this thought of working together and really doing it when you actually have to roll your sleeves up. So got a presentation, hope you guys can handle it. I tried to make it entertaining, but we'll kind of go with it. So. All right, so, whoops, hang on a minute. So, you know, I kind of use the concept of sort of putting theory into practice with Good Neighbor, because it gets very specific about what we can do with it. And shared stewardship came about after Good Neighbor started, which was back in 2014. So I'm going to make an assumption that a lot of people have at least a high-level understanding of what the Good Neighbor Authority is, but just in case, I'm going to do a very brief overview of it so you can get at least a little purview into it. So again, it was established in 2014 under the Farm Bill as a permanent authority under the Farm Bill. So we're guided by a CFR on the work that we do that kind of says what we can and can't do when we, the state, step over on the federal lands and actually support the Forest Service or the BLM to do projects on their land. That was originally the intent, was just the states were going to do this, but then through a series of changes over time, counties and tribes were gained the ability to do it through the authority. One of the big things that it does is it allows the state to use its contracting mechanisms to conduct the work. That is a really big deal. Anybody that's worked with federal contracts knows they're not just simple. They're usually pretty complex and can be very difficult to navigate. And it's just one of those things that's just part of the federal process. So our contracts are fairly streamlined and straightforward. Although I want everybody to understand that even though the state is going to go over and work on federal lands to support federal projects, we have to follow NEPA. That's a change from state uplands, right? Which is a SEPA-based thing with trust mandate and all that. We don't do that. We're completely separate from that process. We take the knowledge and skills we've gained from working in the incredible program that is state uplands with the DNR. But what we're doing is we're taking those skills and we're applying them through the restoration lines. So the last thing that happens is this wheel that's over on the side of this image. It's called the GNA wheel, whatever you want to call it. So ideally the thought is the state comes in, it supports a commercial restoration project. So let's say it's going to be a thinning that has owl habitat as an objective, or elk habitat, or anything where we're trying to basically set those acres on a trajectory. And then from there, we develop revenue. And so what's really interesting about this is the Good Neighbor allows for the revenue to come back to the state, and we hold it essentially in trust for the Forest Service. And it's still federal dollars, no matter what. So what we want to do is then reinvest those dollars back into the forest. So it creates kind of its own funding mechanism, which is pretty neat. And we use those funds to either cover DNR costs or contractor costs. And then we use the rest of the funds to do additional restoration work. So a real quick overview of the Federal Lands Program. really we came to fruition here about 2018 is when we started, and it was basically just me. And you know, poor folks on this call like Eric Wish had to hear me come knock on his door and say, hey, can you help me? You know, going into state uplands to say, please, I can't do this by myself. So what we've grown to is about 14 staff. We're a mixture of restoration specialists, so the land manager folks, engineers that we brought on to sort of be full federal lands engineers, and then management folks who are sort of overseeing the program function. We're funded by a mixture of appropriated funds that come from the Forest Service. Those are either forest budgeted funds, or they're actually regional office funds to do work. We use some state funds to do the work, both operating and capital. And then we use those timber receipts to actually complete the work. So we mix all those funds together to make a really diverse mechanism to complete the work. So again, you heard this discussion about sort of these themes and these things in the MOU related to shared stewardship. Well, the Eastern Washington one, you just heard Paul Hesberg do a great talk about sort of all this kind of stuff, wildfire and its impacts on the landscape. All the work we do in Eastern Washington is focused on those 20-year forest health plan watersheds, and then fuels and wildfire reduction. We do other things, but that's our main focus. In Western Washington, you know, the story is still being written. That's the way I'm going to sort of describe it. The Forest Action Plan has just come out, and it is a robust document that has a lot in it. And what we want to be able to do is contribute to that Forest Action Plan through increasing both terrestrial and aquatic habitat, but also the economies in those rural communities is incredibly important. So we're using kind of all those different things to sort of fuel the types of work we're doing. So what does that work look like? We have been busy over 2 years. We have 50 plus projects that are essentially in various forms of completion. Of those 50, you know, 14 of them are commercial projects, and then 6 of those are large scale sort of hazardous fuels reduction projects. We're doing everything from supporting NEPA planning to elk and salmon habitat. And again, the engineering component is a big deal because that's one of the main needs of the forest. So we're bringing engineers to the table to help them deal with the massive road and infrastructure needs that exist on these forests. As for anybody that's traveled on national forest lands, there's a lot of roads and they're in tough condition, which impacts a lot of things. Going into 21-23, we actually have targeted goals that we're trying to complete on these forests. And we needed to do that because we were kind of doing a little bit of, you know, whatever you guys want, we'll help with, but we can't really do that anymore. Now that the program is established, we need to have a very structured approach to how we are doing this work. And the work that we're doing meets a lot of the goals and strategies and themes and principles of shared stewardship, but it also contributes to the forest 5-year restoration plans as well. So the idea is we're kind of melding all that together, and Good Neighbor is one of the ways to do it. So bringing it back to shared stewardship quickly, again, that MOU was signed in 2019. We started kind of our step with GNA in 2017 when our master agreement was signed. The important thing is that in that agreement, GNA was explicitly called out as one of the tools to complete a lot of these broad themes and principles. And there's a lot more in there than Good Neighbor. I want everybody to understand that. And we have another major partner with this, which is DFW, who's just starting to get into Good Neighbor. And it's a not a quick process to go through it. So hopefully we can help them get their program established and get them up to speed like us. So I use the term Swiss Army knife because I really appreciated the Chief Christensen's talking about the differences of this thing for every single state, because what we do in Washington is not the same thing as Idaho. It's not the same thing as Colorado. It's not the same thing as Massachusetts. They're all different. And we have a very flexible shared stewardship MOU that really just creates the environment to work in. And that's the way I want people to think about it. So Good Neighbor is a very versatile tool that fits this environment well to help increase pace and scale of restoration work on federal lands. So again, GNA implements these broad principles and themes of shared stewardship. And those themes and principles are what you see in front of you. And the idea is that the principles are what allow us to do the work that is within the themes. Great. That sounds really, you know, high level, fluffy, cool. And so what does that actually mean? That's like, I feel like I've gone through these discussions many times with people when they ask me about shared stewardship. Well, what is it? What is shared stewardship? So I'm going to try to bring it down to the ground for you guys right now. So I think of shared stewardship as algebra and GNA is geometry. They kind of work together, but you know, good neighbor, here's a square, and that is a square. Like I can tell you like the limitations of it, what we can and can't do, how much it will cost, all those sort of things. And shared stewardship really informs that square, that geometry. So ideally what ends up happening is we're going to work together to decide a project. That's not new, that's normal. But the big thing that changes is we have a bunch of new tools that are available to us and how we're going to do it. Good Neighbor is one of those tools. And then the next step there is then not saying this is what the forest wants to do and only the forest. It's saying, okay, that's the best tool. Is it meet what we need and what you need? That's the shift. The shift is now saying, well, what does the state and the broader community need? Not just the federal government and its priorities. So shared stewardship is hyper localizing the prioritization process. And again, I love what George said, which he said is using the best resources to complete the work. And Good Neighbor is a powerful tool to sort of bring resources to the table. And once that's decided, the resources will be deployed under whatever method, and then the project will be completed. You heard Kristen talk about a lot of stuff with Joint Chiefs, and that's another method to do the work. I think the take home here, folks, is that what you're hearing from people is a purview into the future of really, there isn't really an us and a them anymore. And it truly is a we. In order for us to work on these broad federal landscapes that are gigantic in scope and scale, the Forest Service cannot do it alone anymore. And that's not a new thing. But what's new is there's new tools to help them. And that's the change. So I'm going to bring you down to an actual project and explain sort of like the concept of shared stewardship and how it was accomplished through this and how it's currently being accomplished. So on the Olympic National Forest, we're installing a 70-foot permanent bridge to open up 2+ miles of critical salmon habitat. First thing, that was never going to be done unless we were here with Good Neighbor. So that's the big thing to understand. We saw that project and we said, heck yes, we're going to figure out a way to do it. There's no instruction manual, but we're going to figure out a way to do it. What DNR is going to do is we're going to implement a timber project, which is our 2D sale. And then we, the DNR, are going to buy the bridge with state dollars. Like that's what we're bringing to the table. We're going to implement the work and we're going to buy the bridge because the bridge had potential to offset the sale in such a way. So we're bringing in some additional funding to help make that sale more successful so the work can be completed. It's really common for people to want to use timber value to make a project be successful. It's actually a very risky sort of model to use because often the work can make the project not be a successful project to be bid. So it meets a bunch of the themes. It meets ecological restoration. It meets sustainable infrastructure. We're clearly doing work for fish habitat. And then it's benefiting the local forest economy by working with contractors locally to bring more work in the woods. And the thing about it, guys, is that it's not all roses and buttercups here. So Good Neighbor is similar to shared stewardship, and it's a concept of change. Okay, it's doing something differently. You know, we, the state, are trying to bring resources to the table to try to do something that has never been done before. No one's installed a 70-foot bridge using a state contract through a timber sale that the state's managing on federal lands. That's not been done before. One of the big things to understand is that there's an associated workload with shared stewardship or Good Neighbor, which is that despite the fact that you want to go do work on federal lands, whatever tool you want to use, you still need the Forest Service to give you their thumbs up or their okay, because you can't just go do it. That's not how this works. It's a mutual thing that has checks and balances. One of the things is that with the Forest Service, when you bring a really complex project to this, they're overwhelmed already with work. And even though Good Neighbor is here to sort of help with that, we still add work to their plate because they still need to respond to us. They still need to work with us. They still need to come look at stuff in the woods with us. And it can create kind of a conflict of priorities because Good Neighbor and shared stewardship are really important, but you know, a bridge engineer has 30 plus projects they're already working on, and we're like, hey, come do this. It's hard for them to say, oh, I'm going to drop all that and do this. It's a continuous thing, but the thing is that once it gets going, it usually benefits it. But initially, we're moving a lot of people's cheese because we're doing stuff different. And in that process of sort of talking through doing things differently, it's like you're speaking French and speaking Spanish, and we're both trying to speak English. There's going to be translation errors, and that's okay because that's part of the process. And the big thing we're doing is it's a culture change. It's a culture change for the DNR. It's a culture change for the Forest Service. We are doing things differently. And so on the horizon, as you saw, we have kind of our 21-23 program targets we're trying to do. And you heard the House Bill 1168. That's sort of on the docket, which if that comes through in full capacity, it is going to change the game for a lot of people who are on this discussion today. And we as a program are preparing for sort of an increase in growth and then the pace that's going to be with that. So with that, I'll kind of end. And hopefully that was interesting.
Trevor, that was a great description of things happening on the ground. And I have one question for you. Is it possible to use the Good Neighbor Authority to secure a long-term agreement with the Forest Service for log supply to support the forest products industry in their efforts to develop a wood processing facility in a location like Chelan County?
Oh man, there's a lot in that question. So I think it's not really about an agreement. I think it's about getting in place the environment to create that situation. And an agreement is just an agreement. It's a piece of paper. But an agreement doesn't matter if the environment doesn't allow for that work to occur. So the bigger thing is getting the planning processes and the boots on the ground bodies in place to create the consistency. That's what's missing. It's not an agreement. That's the issue, is that you're missing part of the equation, which is you need people out in the woods that are putting the projects out. And that's what I think you need, not so much an agreement.
More like staffing or
staffing, process, that change in culture, that working relationship, all of those things need to be boosted. So that's what I'm seeing. But the short answer, I don't think you can make an agreement through Good Neighbor. It'd be through a separate process to make some sort of an agreement like that, but it wouldn't be through Good Neighbor.
Okay. Thank you, Trevor.